At the inheritance meeting, my father and brother laughed at me. You only get an old business card, that's all you deserve. But when I tracked down the secret notary, a $37.8 million company was waiting for me. The next day, their laughter turned into pure terror. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Elena Mercer. I'm 32 years old, and by the time this story began, I had spent more than a decade feeling like a guest in my own family. The call about my grandfather Arthur's death didn't surprise me. He was 87. The invitation to the will reading did. A week later, I was driving back to Lexington for the first time in months, wondering why I had agreed to come. Not because I expected money. I didn't. At 21, I left home to join the military. My father, Richard Mercer, hated the decision. After my service ended, I started a property renovation business from scratch. No family investment, no Mercer connections, just long days, bad contracts, and years of figuring things out on my own. Somewhere along the way, my family stopped treating me like part of the picture. Phone calls became rare, invitations disappeared. Eventually, I stopped chasing people who clearly weren't interested. The only exception was Grandpa Arthur. He never made a big show of it. Every few months, a letter would arrive. Sometimes advice, sometimes a funny story, sometimes just a few lines asking how business was going. Those letters mattered more than he probably knew. By the time I parked outside Harrison and Cole Legal Group, they were some of the few family memories I actually looked forward to. The building was already crowded when I walked in. Conversations slowed the moment people noticed me, not because they were happy to see me, more because they seemed surprised I had shown up. A few relatives nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Then I saw my father. He was standing near the window with my older brother Brandon, the future king of the Mercer family business. At least that's how everyone treated him. Brandon noticed me first. Elena. Brandon. That was it. No smile, no hug, no attempt to catch up. Just my name. A few moments later, my father walked over. I hadn't seen him in person in almost 2 years. Glad you made it, he said. Good to see you too, Dad. How's business? Doing fine. Good? The conversation died right there. He gave a quick nod and returned to Brandon. Honestly, talking to a bank teller would have felt more personal. I watched them continue their conversation as if nothing had happened. That familiar ache settled in my chest. Not anger, just disappointment. The kind you've already learned to live with. A few minutes later, my cousin Victoria approached. Unlike everyone else, she looked genuinely unsure of what to say. Hey, she said. Hey. I wasn't sure you'd come. I laughed. Neither was I. That finally got a smile out of her. We talked for a minute about work and life. Nothing important. But it felt normal, which was rare around the Mercers. Before she walked away, she hesitated, like there was something she wanted to say. But someone called her name, and the moment disappeared. Soon afterward, one of the attorneys opened the conference room doors. Everyone started taking seats around a long table. I found a chair near the far end and quietly watched the room. That's when I noticed something. People weren't acting nervous about the will. They were acting expectant. My father already seemed confident. Brandon looked relaxed. Several relatives were discussing properties and investments before the meeting had even started. It felt less like a memorial and more like a business transaction everyone thought they already understood. And the more I watched them, the more one uncomfortable thought kept creeping into my mind. Nobody seemed concerned about what I might receive. Nobody asked. Nobody wondered. It was almost as if they had already decided I wasn't part of the equation. The attorney placed a thick folder on the table and cleared his throat. Conversation stopped. Everyone leaned forward. As the reading was about to begin, I suddenly found myself wondering if the only thing my family expected me to inherit was a seat in the room. The attorney opened the folder and the room immediately quieted down. A few relatives had been whispering moments earlier. Now nobody wanted to miss a single word. Grandpa Arthur's estate was substantial. Everyone knew that. The reading started with charitable donations, trust funds, and several investment accounts. One by one, names were called. Everything had been planned carefully. Every asset came with specific instructions. Nothing felt random. That caught my attention. Grandpa had always been thoughtful, but listening to the details, I realized he must have spent years preparing this. Several relatives received properties. One cousin inherited investment accounts. An aunt received a valuable collection Grandpa had spent decades building. Nobody seemed surprised. Most people looked like they were getting exactly what they expected. Then the attorney looked up. Richard Mercer. My father's posture immediately changed. The attorney announced that the Mercer family home would belong entirely to him. For the first time that morning, I saw real emotion on Dad's face. Not grief. Relief. Like he had been worried about this outcome and finally got the answer he wanted. A few relatives congratulated him quietly. He accepted their comments with small nods and a smile that hadn't appeared once since I arrived. A little later, the attorney called Brandon's name. That got everyone's attention. The main Mercer Company. Control of operations. Leadership authority. Everything people had assumed would eventually go to Brandon. And now, it officially had. Several relatives smiled. One uncle leaned over and shook his hand. Congratulations. Thank you, Brandon said. He tried to sound humble, but I knew him too well. The slight grin. The confidence. The way he sat a little taller afterward. He looked exactly like someone whose future had just been confirmed. I glanced toward my father. He looked proud. Very proud. The kind of expression I couldn't remember ever seeing directed at me. The reading continued. More properties, more investments, more assets. Everything had obvious value. Everything made sense. And the longer I listened, the more I started wondering where I fit into any of it. I wasn't expecting millions. Honestly, I wasn't expecting much at all. But Grandpa and I had stayed in touch over the years. He wrote letters, asked about my business, checked on me when nobody else did. Part of me thought there might be something personal waiting. A watch, a keepsake, a letter, anything. My name still hadn't been called. Victoria glanced toward me once from across the table, then quickly looked away. Maybe she was wondering the same thing. Around the room, people were already discussing future plans in low voices. The estate wasn't even finished being distributed yet. I sat quietly and listened. With every passing minute, I felt less like a family member and more like an observer. Then the attorney paused. He turned a page, looked down for a moment. Finally, he spoke. Elena Mercer. Every conversation stopped. I sat up. The attorney reached into a separate folder beside him. Not the main estate folder. A different one. For a second, I thought maybe Grandpa had left me a letter. The attorney removed a small object and walked toward me. I frowned. It looked ordinary. Very ordinary. He stopped beside my chair and placed it in my hand. An old business card. Nothing else. Just a worn business card. I stared at it, then looked up. That's my inheritance? The attorney's face revealed nothing. Those were Mr. Arthur Mercer's instructions. The room had gone completely silent. I lowered my eyes to the card again. A company name was printed across the front. One I had never seen before. I turned the card over, then back again. That was it. No account numbers, no legal documents, no explanation. Just a company name I had never heard before. The attorney returned to the front of the room and continued reading the will as if nothing unusual had happened. Everyone else tried to do the same. Tried. A few people were already exchanging looks. One uncle leaned toward another and whispered something. A cousin smirked. I slipped the card into my hand and kept quiet. There wasn't much else to do. The reading continued for another 20 minutes. More assets were distributed. More signatures were required. But honestly, I barely heard any of it. I kept replaying the moment in my head. Grandpa was many things. Stubborn. Private. Sometimes impossible to understand. But he wasn't careless. If he wanted me to receive nothing, he could have simply left me nothing. Why go through the trouble of putting my name in the will? Why have an attorney personally hand me an old business card? None of it made sense. Eventually, the meeting ended. Chairs moved, folders closed. People stood and immediately began discussing who got what. The atmosphere shifted from grief to business surprisingly fast. I was about to leave when Brandon appeared beside me. "Well," he said, trying not to smile, "I guess Grandpa really wanted to send a message." I looked at him. "What message would that be?" He shrugged. "You left. We stayed." A few nearby relatives heard that and suddenly became very interested in their phones. Nobody wanted to be part of the conversation, but nobody walked away either. I let out a slow breath. "Congratulations on the company, Brandon." That seemed to disappoint him. He was looking for an argument. Instead, I picked up my bag. Before I could leave, he nodded toward the card in my hand. "At least you got something." A couple of people laughed. Not loudly, just enough. That was somehow worse. I glanced toward my father. Part of me expected him to say something, anything. Maybe tell Brandon to stop. Maybe remind everyone this was still Grandpa's funeral week. Instead, Dad remained silent. He adjusted some papers, avoided eye contact, and continued speaking with another relative. That hurt more than Brandon's joke. Because Brandon had always been Brandon. Dad was different. Or at least I used to think so. As I walked toward the exit, Victoria caught up with me. "Elena." I stopped. She looked uncomfortable. The way people look when they know something unfair just happened but don't know how to fix it. "I'm sorry." I gave her a small smile. "For what?" She glanced toward the conference room. "You know." I did know. But I wasn't going to make her say it. "It's fine." Neither of us believed that. Victoria hesitated before speaking again. "Your grandfather cared about you." The comment caught me off guard. "Why would you say that?" She shrugged. "Because he talked about you." That was new. Grandpa and I exchanged letters, but he rarely discussed family matters. "What did he say?" A sad smile crossed her face. "Mostly that you never asked him for anything." Before I could respond, someone called her name. She gave my arm a gentle squeeze and headed back inside. I stood there for a moment, thinking about that. Then I walked out to the parking lot. The drive home started quietly. The card sat in the cup holder beside me. For nearly an hour, I ignored it. I listened to the road, thought about Grandpa, thought about the awkward silence from my father, thought about how quickly people reveal themselves when money enters the room. If you've ever experienced something similar, you probably know exactly what I mean. Around a red light outside a small town, I reached over and picked up the card again. The company name still meant nothing to me. No logo, no address, nothing familiar. I turned it over once more. This time my thumb caught on something. I frowned. The back didn't feel completely flat. Pulling into a gas station parking lot, I put the car in park and looked more closely. A tiny, folded piece of paper had been tucked behind the card. So small, I almost missed it. My heartbeat sped up a little. Carefully, I slid the note free, and for the first time all day, it felt like Grandpa might actually be trying to tell me something. I unfolded the tiny note right there in the gas station parking lot. The handwriting was instantly familiar. Arthur Mercer. My grandfather's handwriting had always looked neat, even when he was in his 80s. The note contained only 2 lines. Trust the card. And beneath it was a name, Harold Whitaker, along with an address in Lexington. I read it twice, then a third time. That was all. No explanation, no instructions. Just a name and an address. Most people probably would have thrown the card away after what happened at the will reading. For a moment, I understood why, but Grandpa wasn't the kind of man who played pointless games. If he wanted me to meet someone, there was a reason. I slipped the note back into my wallet and started the drive home. The entire way, my mind kept returning to Grandpa. Not the businessman everyone admired, the version I knew, the one who mailed handwritten letters when everyone else sent text messages, the one who remembered details, the one who somehow always knew when I was struggling. When I got home, I walked straight to my office. A small metal filing cabinet sat beside my desk. I unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside was a stack of envelopes tied together with a faded blue ribbon. 39 letters. I had counted them once. Every letter Grandpa had sent me over the years. I sat down and pulled one from the middle. The date on top was from nearly 6 years earlier, back when my business was barely surviving. I smiled as I read one section. Don't confuse slow progress with failure. Most worthwhile things take longer than people expect. At the time, I had been fighting to keep my company alive. I never told him how worried I was. Somehow he knew anyway. That was Arthur. He rarely asked direct questions. Yet somehow he always saw more than people realized. I opened another letter, then another. One was about patience, another about leadership. One included a newspaper clipping he thought I'd find funny. None of them talked about money. None of them mentioned inheritance. Looking back, that felt important. Grandpa never measured people by what they owned. Not once. The next morning, I called the number listed online for Harold Whitaker. No answer. I tried again an hour later. Still nothing. By lunchtime, my curiosity had completely taken over, so I got in my truck and drove to the address from the note. The building was located on a quiet street near downtown Lexington. Nothing flashy. Just a professional office tucked between 2 older brick buildings. The sign outside simply read, Whitaker Notary Services. I sat in the parking lot for a moment. Part of me felt ridiculous, driving across town because of a mysterious note hidden behind an old business card. Then I remembered the look on Grandpa's face every time he told me to trust my instincts. That settled it. I grabbed the card and headed inside. The waiting area was almost empty. A receptionist sat behind a desk reviewing paperwork. She looked up as I entered. "Can I help you?" I pulled the business card from my pocket. "Maybe. I'm looking for Harold Whitaker." The receptionist's expression immediately changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. She glanced toward a closed office door, then back at me. "Your name?" "Elena Mercer." Before I could say anything else, the office door opened. An older man stepped out. Gray hair, dark suit, calm expression. His eyes landed on me for less than a second. Then he smiled. Not the polite smile people use with strangers. The smile of someone recognizing an expected guest. "Miss Mercer," he said. I stopped walking, because I hadn't introduced myself yet. And somehow, Harold Whitaker already knew exactly who I was. I stared at Harold Whitaker for a second. "I'm sorry," I said. "Have we met before?" He chuckled softly. "No, Miss Mercer, but I was told to expect you." That wasn't exactly reassuring. He stepped aside and gestured toward his office. "Please, come in." The room was simple and organized. A desk, several filing cabinets, framed certificates on the wall. Nothing about it suggested secrets worth chasing across Lexington. Harold closed the door behind us and sat down. I remained standing. "Okay," I said. I think I've earned an explanation. His smile widened slightly. That's exactly what your grandfather said you would say. That caught me off guard. He opened a drawer and removed a thick folder. Not a piece of paper, not a letter. A folder. The kind lawyers use when there's a lot to discuss. He placed it on the desk between us. Arthur Mercer established instructions years ago regarding this meeting. Years ago. Not months. Not recently. Years. I finally sat down. What is this? Your inheritance. I frowned. I already received my inheritance. I pulled out the business card. Harold shook his head. No. You received the key. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he opened the folder. The first page contained legal documents. The second contained company registration records. The third contained ownership certificates. I recognized the company name immediately, Mercer Legacy Group, the same name printed on the card. What exactly is Mercer Legacy Group? I asked. Harold folded his hands. It is a privately held company established by Arthur Mercer approximately 11 years ago. 11 years. The same year I left home. I looked up. Why have I never heard of it? Because very few people have. He slid another document toward me. Corporate records, project summaries, financial reports. The pages kept coming. And with each page, my confusion grew. This wasn't some tiny side business. It wasn't a hobby company. It wasn't an empty shell. It was real. Very real. The company owned commercial properties, investment partnerships, development projects, assets spread across multiple counties. I found myself flipping pages faster, trying to catch up, trying to understand what I was looking at. Wait. I stopped. Are you telling me Grandpa built an entirely separate company while still running Mercer Enterprises? Yes. And nobody knew? Harold tilted his head. Very few people knew. I leaned back in my chair. The room suddenly felt smaller. Growing up, everything in the Mercer family revolved around the main company. Every conversation, every family gathering, every expectation. Brandon had spent years preparing to inherit it, yet somehow Arthur had built something else entirely. Something hidden, something none of us had ever heard mentioned. I looked down at another document. Owner designation, successor designation. My eyes stopped moving. Then I read it again, and again, because I thought I must have misunderstood. Harold. My voice sounded strange. Why is my name here? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned another page and pointed to a section already highlighted. I followed the line with my eyes. There it was. Clear as day. Sole successor beneficiary. Elena Mercer. No siblings, no shared ownership, no trust committee, just me. I looked up. That can't be right. It is. There has to be some mistake. There isn't. I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because my brain didn't know what else to do. For years, I had assumed Grandpa cared about me. The letters proved that. But this? This was something entirely different. This wasn't affection. This was planning. Long-term planning. The kind that takes years, maybe decades. Suddenly, dozens of old memories felt different. The questions Grandpa used to ask about my business, the advice in his letters, the conversations about leadership, about responsibility, about earning trust. At the time, they felt like ordinary discussions. Now I wasn't so sure. Harold reached for another section of the folder. There's one more thing you should see. I took a deep breath. Honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted any more surprises. But he had already turned the page. Several financial statements appeared. Balance sheets, asset summaries, valuation reports. Numbers filled the pages. Large numbers. Very large numbers. And as my eyes moved from one document to the next, I slowly realized I had no idea how much Mercer Legacy Group was actually worth. I looked at the valuation report 3 times before the number finally registered. $37.8 million. Not revenue, not projections. Estimated company value. I actually pushed the folder away from me. That's not possible. Harold didn't argue. He simply waited. The way people do when they know the facts won't change no matter how many times you question them. I looked back down. The number was still there. 37.8 million. My grandfather had quietly built a company worth nearly $40 million while the entire family focused on Mercer Enterprises. And somehow, according to every document in front of me, I was now responsible for it. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Harold slid another packet across the desk. This may help answer some of your questions. Inside were summaries of active projects, commercial renovations, property redevelopment agreements, investment partnerships. The company wasn't sitting dormant, it was operating, right now. People were working, contracts were active, deadlines existed. I flipped through page after page. Who has been running all this? Mr. Mercer maintained oversight until his death. Harold paused. With assistance from a management team he trusted. A management team. That somehow made everything feel even more real. This wasn't an inheritance sitting in a bank account. It was an entire organization, a living business. I rubbed my forehead. I'm a renovation contractor. Harold smiled slightly. Arthur was aware of that. Then why would he leave me this? The answer came immediately. Because he believed you could lead. Simple, direct. Exactly the kind of answer Grandpa would have given. A few minutes later, Harold arranged for me to meet several senior employees connected to Mercer Legacy Group. The meeting happened that same afternoon. I expected skepticism. I expected awkward introductions. Instead, something completely different happened. The first man I met shook my hand and said, "We've heard a lot about you." That caught me off guard. The second person smiled. "So you're finally here. Finally here. Not nice to meet you. Not who are you. Finally here." By the time the third employee said something similar, I started realizing something strange. These people knew my name. Not personally, but enough to recognize it. Enough to expect me. Grandpa hadn't simply named me in paperwork. He had apparently talked about me for years. That realization stayed with me the entire drive home. The next morning, my phone started ringing. At first, it was harmless. A distant cousin. An uncle I hadn't spoken to in years. People checking in. People asking questions. People suddenly interested in my life. Funny how quickly attention appears when money enters a conversation. Then my father called. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. "Hello? Elena." His voice sounded unusually warm, almost cheerful. We hadn't spoken that way in years. "How are you doing?" he asked. I nearly laughed. The last time he had asked that question, I couldn't remember. "I'm fine. Good. Good." An awkward silence followed. Then he asked about my business, my employees, my projects. Questions he had never shown interest in before. The conversation wasn't hostile. That's what made it strange. Everything felt too friendly. When the call finally ended, I sat there looking at my phone. Something had changed. I just wasn't sure how much. That afternoon, another call came through. "Brandon." I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered. "Hey, can we talk?" I blinked. That alone was unusual. "What about? In person?" His answer came too quickly. There was a pause. Then he added, "Just the two of us?" Curiosity got the better of me. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop near downtown Lexington. The conversation started politely enough. Work, family, The funeral. Small talk neither of us actually cared about. Then Brandon leaned forward. The friendly tone disappeared. Not completely. Just enough. Enough for me to notice. Enough to make me sit a little straighter. He studied my face for a second, then asked a question that instantly changed the atmosphere between us. How much did Grandpa tell you before he died? Brandon held my gaze while waiting for an answer. How much did Grandpa tell you before he died? I set my coffee down. What exactly are you asking? You know what I'm asking. No, I don't. His jaw tightened. For a second, he looked like he was debating how honest he wanted to be. Then he leaned back. Did he ever mention Mercer Legacy Group? I shook my head. No. Not once? Not once. That answer didn't seem to reassure him. Actually, it seemed to make him even more suspicious. The conversation never recovered after that. We talked for another 10 minutes, but neither of us was really talking anymore. We were measuring each other, testing reactions, looking for something. When we finally stood up, Brandon barely touched his coffee. I guess we'll see what comes out eventually. That wasn't a normal goodbye, and we both knew it. The following week became increasingly strange. People I hadn't heard from in years suddenly wanted updates. Relatives called with questions disguised as concern. Some were subtle, others weren't. One aunt asked if I was handling everything okay. 5 minutes later, she was asking about company ownership documents. Another cousin wanted to know whether Grandpa had left private instructions. Word was spreading. Fast. At first, I tried ignoring it. Then Victoria called. Have you talked to Dad lately? She asked. Dad? Or my dad? She gave a small laugh. Fair point. Your dad. Not much. Why? There was a pause, long enough to make me sit up straighter. People are talking. I already knew that, but her tone suggested something more. What kind of talking? Victoria sighed. The kind that starts with questions and turns into rumors. I didn't say anything. Some people think Grandpa changed his plans at the last minute. I felt my stomach tighten. And? Some think somebody influenced him. There it was. The word she didn't want to say. Influenced. Manipulated. I stared out the window of my office. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Victoria continued. I don't believe that, Elena. I know. I just thought you should hear it from me before somebody else tells you. I appreciated that, more than she probably realized. As the days passed, the rumors became harder to ignore. Nobody accused me directly. Not yet. But I started noticing changes. Conversations stopping when I entered a room. People suddenly becoming careful with their words. Questions that sounded less like curiosity and more like investigations. Then my father called. His voice was polite. Too polite. We should all sit down and talk. About what? About your grandfather's decision. I almost laughed. It was his decision. That's exactly what we're trying to understand. There was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Doubt. Or maybe disappointment. I wasn't sure which bothered me more. What are you really saying, Dad? The silence lasted several seconds. Finally, he answered. I just find it difficult to believe this happened without anyone knowing. I closed my eyes. There it was. Not a direct accusation, but close enough. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Neither of us sounded angry. Somehow that made it worse. A few days later, I attended a family gathering connected to Grandpa's memorial donations. Nothing formal, just a small event. The atmosphere felt different the moment I arrived. People were polite, friendly even, but underneath it all was tension. I could feel it. At one point, I overheard two relatives discussing Arthur's mental state during his final years. Not quietly enough. One of them stopped talking the second she noticed me listening. Victoria stepped in before I could say anything. Arthur knew exactly what he was doing. The table went silent. Nobody argued with her, but nobody agreed either. For the first time, I realized she was taking a risk simply by defending me. That mattered, more than I could put into words. Unfortunately, Brandon seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. Every interaction became sharper, shorter, more aggressive. The mocking attitude from the will reading was gone. Now he looked frustrated, almost desperate, like someone trying to solve a problem that refused to make sense. 3 days later, a certified envelope arrived at my office. My assistant handed it to me. Looks important. I noticed the return address immediately. A law firm. My chest tightened. Slowly, I opened the envelope. The letter inside was brief, professional, and impossible to misunderstand. A legal challenge regarding Arthur Mercer's estate was being prepared. I read the page twice, then looked at the signature at the bottom. The attorney represented Brandon Mercer, and suddenly the rumors didn't feel like rumors anymore. I sat at my desk for nearly 10 minutes with the letter in front of me, not reading it, just staring at it. Part of me wanted to call Brandon immediately and demand an explanation. Another part already knew it wouldn't help. If lawyers were involved, the decision had already been made. My phone rang before I could decide what to do. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Elena Mercer? Yes. My name is Rebecca Lawson. The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered. Harold Whitaker had mentioned it briefly during our first meeting. Arthur Mercer asked me to represent you if certain circumstances arose. I almost laughed. Let me guess. Those circumstances just arrived in a certified envelope. There was a short pause. Then Rebecca chuckled. Something like that. An hour later, I was sitting across from her in a conference room. Rebecca looked calm in a way I immediately appreciated. No unnecessary drama, no exaggerated concern, just confidence. She reviewed the letter from Brandon's attorneys and nodded. Not surprising. That's not exactly comforting. It wasn't meant to be. That caught me off guard. Rebecca folded her hands. Elena, your grandfather spent years preparing for potential challenges. Years. I was starting to hear that word a lot. She opened a large binder and slid it toward me. The tabs alone were intimidating. Corporate records, ownership documents, estate planning, correspondence, independent evaluations. Everything was organized. Everything was indexed. Everything looked prepared. Not recently. Prepared long ago. For the first time since receiving the legal notice, I felt some of the pressure ease from my shoulders. Maybe because someone in the room actually knew what they were doing, and maybe because that person clearly wasn't panicking. A few days later, Rebecca arranged another meeting, this time with Walter Hayes. The name appeared in several Mercer legacy documents. When he walked into the room, I immediately understood why Grandpa trusted him. Walter looked like someone who had spent decades solving problems. No fancy introductions. No corporate performance. Just a firm handshake. So you're Elena. That's me. He smiled. Arthur talked about you constantly. Apparently everyone except me had known that. Walter laughed when he saw my expression. He was proud of you. The comment hit harder than I expected. We spent most of the afternoon reviewing Mercer legacy projects. Unlike the summaries Harold showed me earlier, Walter knew the stories behind them, the setbacks, the risks, the decisions. He could tell you why a building was purchased 10 years ago and why Arthur refused to sell it 5 years later. What impressed me most wasn't his knowledge. It was how often my grandfather's name came up. Not as a boss, as a leader, someone people genuinely respected. At one point, Walter opened a storage cabinet and pulled out several archive boxes. There are more. I stared at them. More? A lot more. Inside were project files, correspondence, meeting notes, and years of documentation. Arthur had preserved everything, every major decision, every major conversation. The deeper we looked, the clearer the picture became. Mercer Legacy wasn't a secret experiment. It was a carefully constructed plan, and Arthur had documented nearly every step. For the first time since the conflict started, I stopped feeling like I was reacting. I started feeling prepared. Not completely, but more than before. At the end of the meeting, Rebecca remained behind while Walter left. She opened one final folder. A smaller one I hadn't seen before. "There's something you should look at." I accepted the document. The date immediately caught my attention. It had been signed years earlier. Long before Arthur became ill. Long before the will reading. Long before anyone knew Mercer Legacy even existed. "What is this?" Rebecca watched me carefully. "A contingency file." I frowned. "For what?" She tapped a paragraph near the bottom of the page. I read it once, then again. My grandfather had written specific legal instructions regarding potential challenges to the inheritance, potential disputes, potential accusations, potential lawsuits. He had outlined them one by one. My eyes slowly lifted from the page. Rebecca nodded. "Arthur didn't just build a company." She pointed toward the document in my hands. "He expected this fight to happen." I read the contingency file twice. The more I read, the more I understood what Rebecca meant. Grandpa hadn't simply hoped his plans would survive scrutiny. He had prepared for scrutiny. The file referenced legal reviews, witness statements, and supporting documents going back years. Nothing about Mercer Legacy looked rushed. Nothing looked accidental. A few days later, Rebecca invited me to another strategy meeting. Walter was already there, along with 2 members of her legal team. Folders covered the conference table. Rebecca slid 2 reports toward me. "These are important." I opened the first one. Medical records. The second looked similar. "What am I looking at?" "Independent cognitive evaluations." I immediately understood. Brandon's challenge depended on proving Arthur wasn't mentally capable of making these decisions. These reports said otherwise. Both evaluations concluded the same thing. Arthur Mercer was mentally competent, fully aware of his business and legal decisions. Different specialists, different years, same conclusion. I let out a slow breath. "So, he expected this argument?" Walter smiled. "Arthur expected most arguments." The meeting continued. Corporate records, ownership documents, operating agreements. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Mercer Legacy had been created legally, managed legally, transferred legally. The deeper we looked, the stronger the evidence became. For the first time since receiving the lawsuit notice, I felt genuinely confident. Not because I wanted to fight my family, because I finally understood that Grandpa hadn't left loose ends. The strange part was Brandon. The stronger the evidence became, the harder he pushed. I saw it during a family gathering a few days later. At one point, he started questioning Arthur's decisions again. Not directly accusing anyone, just asking questions designed to create doubt. What caught my attention was my father. Richard wasn't helping him anymore. A few weeks earlier, he had echoed many of Brandon's concerns. Now he mostly listened. Quietly. Watching. Thinking. Several times Brandon looked toward him as if expecting support. It never came. Dad wasn't suddenly on my side, but he seemed less certain than before. And Brandon noticed. By the end of the evening, he was arguing harder than everyone else combined. People were visibly uncomfortable. Even relatives who originally supported him avoided getting involved. A few days later, Walter called. His tone was different, focused. "Can you come by the office? Something wrong?" "Maybe." An hour later, I found him surrounded by archived financial records, Boxes covered an entire conference table. Walter handed me 2 reports. "Look at these." At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then he pointed to several transactions. The numbers didn't match. One report showed transfers that were missing from the other. Not small differences either. Thousands of dollars, then tens of thousands. I frowned. Accounting error? Walter shook his head immediately. No. The answer came too fast to be a guess. He slid another document toward me. More discrepancies. More missing entries. My stomach tightened. "I've worked with Arthur for 30 years, Walter said quietly. "And I've never seen records like this." I looked down at the paperwork again. For weeks, we'd been dealing with rumors and accusations. Now we were looking at something tangible. Actual numbers, actual records. And whatever story those records were hiding, it clearly hadn't been part of Arthur's original plan. Walter spread several documents across the conference table. Nobody said much. The silence itself told me this wasn't good. I looked from one report to another. Spreadsheets, transaction logs, approval records, the kind of paperwork most people would find boring. But Walter was staring at them like they contained a confession. "Show me," I said. He pointed to a group of highlighted entries. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Vendor payments, project expenses, transfer authorizations. Then he showed me the matching records. Or rather, the records that should have matched. Several transactions appeared in one set of files but were documented differently in another. The discrepancies weren't random. They followed a pattern, a very expensive pattern. Rebecca joined us halfway through the review. She sat down, studied the documents, and immediately understood why Walter was concerned. "How much are we talking about?" Walter exhaled slowly. "Close to $287,000. The number hung in the room. I looked up. "Missing?" "Not exactly." That answer wasn't comforting. Walter slid another page toward me. "The money moved." "Legally?" "Technically, yes." "Then what's the issue?" He tapped several signatures, several approval chains, several project decisions, and then he stopped at one name, Brandon Mercer. For a moment, nobody spoke. I looked at the page again, then another, and another. The same name kept appearing. Not on every transaction, but enough. Enough to raise questions. Questions that suddenly felt much more serious than an inheritance dispute. I leaned back in my chair. "This doesn't automatically mean wrongdoing." "No," Rebecca agreed. "It doesn't. But it means we need answers." That was harder to argue with. Over the next week, more records were reviewed. The deeper we went, the clearer something became. Arthur had already noticed these issues, months before his death, possibly years. That discovery surprised me more than the financial discrepancies themselves. Grandpa hadn't simply documented the company's growth, he had documented concerns, questions, reviews, follow-up investigations. The man had built an archive for practically everything. One afternoon, Walter opened another file box. Inside was a collection of internal audit reports, some completed, some unfinished. One report immediately caught his attention. He handed it to me. Attached to the front was a note written in Arthur's handwriting, just one sentence. "If circumstances require it, this file must be preserved." I stared at the page, then at Walter, then back at the note. The realization hit me slowly. Arthur wasn't only protecting me. He was protecting Mercer Legacy, protecting the employees, protecting the projects, protecting everything he had spent years building. And apparently, he believed that might someday require evidence. That changed the way I viewed everything. For weeks, I had focused on the inheritance, on the lawsuit, on my family. Arthur had been thinking much bigger than that. A few days later, Richard called. His voice sounded tired, not angry, not defensive, just tired. Can we talk? We met at a small diner neither of us had visited in years. The conversation started awkwardly, mostly because neither of us knew where to begin. Eventually he spoke. "Brandon says you're building a case against him." I set down my coffee. "I'm reviewing company records." "Is there a difference?" I looked at him carefully. For the first time, he didn't sound certain. He sounded worried. About Brandon. About the family. Maybe about himself. "I haven't accused anyone of anything," I said. And it was true. Richard nodded slowly. But he didn't defend Brandon the way he once would have. That alone told me a lot. By the time we left the diner, I realized something important. The conflict was changing. This wasn't simply about who inherited what anymore. The questions were getting bigger, and the answers were becoming harder to ignore. A family meeting had already been scheduled for the following week. Rebecca believed we should be prepared. Walter agreed. That evening, I sat alone in my office with Arthur's files spread across my desk. The audit reports sat on one side. The lawsuit documents sat on the other. For the first time, I faced a choice Grandpa himself could no longer make. I could bring the evidence into the open, or I could keep searching for a peaceful resolution. The family meeting was only days away, and I still hadn't decided which path I was willing to take. Nobody looked comfortable when the family meeting started. Not Brandon, not my father, not even me. Rebecca sat beside me. Walter was across the table. Brandon arrived with his attorney, while Richard and Victoria took seats near the back. The discussion began the way everyone expected. Questions about Arthur's decisions. Questions about Mercer legacy. Questions about whether everything had been done properly. Then Rebecca started opening files. Corporate records, ownership documents, medical evaluations, witness statements. Years of documentation Arthur had prepared long before any of us were sitting in that room. One by one, the arguments lost momentum. Nobody had to raise their voice. The paperwork did the talking. The turning point came when the audit reports were reviewed. No accusations, no dramatic confrontations, just facts. Questions that needed answers, transactions that required explanations. For the first time, Brandon didn't seem to have a response. He studied the documents quietly, then leaned back in his chair. The room felt very different after that. Eventually, even his attorney stopped arguing and started discussing options. The lawsuit no longer looked like a battle Brandon could win. By the end of the meeting, a settlement had been reached. The legal challenge would be withdrawn. Mercer legacy would remain under my control, and the matter would stay out of court. Nobody celebrated. Everyone just looked tired. As people started leaving, Brandon gathered his papers. He paused beside me. For a second, I thought he might say something. Instead, he simply nodded and walked away. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell me the fight was over. A few minutes later, only my father and I remained in the room. The silence felt awkward. Finally, he spoke. "I should have been there more." I looked at him. Neither of us needed a long speech. Years of distance couldn't be fixed in a single conversation. But for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't pretending everything had been fine. "I know," I said. He nodded, then quietly added, "I'm sorry." We sat there for a moment. Not magically healed, just honest. Before leaving, he asked if I'd be willing to have dinner sometime. Just the two of us. I said yes. A few months later, Mercer Legacy was moving forward. I spent most of my time learning from the team Arthur had trusted. Walter helped constantly. Rebecca still checked in when needed. And surprisingly, Victoria became the family member I spoke with most. She never tried to force a relationship. She just kept showing up. Little by little, that mattered. The project closest to my heart became Arthur's final dream, a downtown revitalization effort that most investors had already given up on. One evening, after visiting the project site, I returned to my office and opened one of Arthur's old letters. I had read it before, but this time it felt different. As I sat there looking out the window, I realized something. The company mattered, the money mattered, the victory mattered. But none of those things were the reason I kept moving forward. For 11 years, while most of my family barely knew what was happening in my life, Arthur never stopped believing in me. He wrote letters, he checked in, he paid attention. Long before he left me a company, he gave me something far more important: confidence. The belief that I was capable of building a life on my own terms. I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. Outside, workers were finishing another day on the project Arthur had dreamed about for years. Tomorrow, there would be more meetings, more problems, more decisions. Life would keep moving. And honestly, that felt right. Before I finish my story, I'd love to know your opinion. Do you think Brandon ever truly accepted Arthur's decision, or did he simply run out of ways to fight it? Let me know in the comments.